All right, thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate this. Now, I used to put out a note saying what time would be best for people to meet. And I actually found if I just say, hey, we're going to do it at this time, I have about 3 times as many people showing up, believe it or not. So otherwise, it would have been just one person. My thoughts about tonight, what we're going to be doing is the reason why I'd like to do weekly Teams meetings with people, and then require everybody who wasn't or everybody to either attend or watch the recording, is because these meetings are an opportunity to give something of a background and context to that week's module, as well as an opportunity to answer any questions or give clarification for any of the assignments. So we only have about an hour and a half, and what I want to cover today is basically, in addition to this week's information, I want to cover what attendance looks like, expectations for both of us, the research and introduce you to the research and discovery projects, talk about the weekly reflections, and as well talk about my take on artistic critique. Now, none of you are taking my 2710 class this semester, right? Okay. Whoever is, we about maybe 2/3 of that class, we cover the same kind of stuff that we're going to be covering here. But I do really appreciate you guys, everybody showing up who is participating. One of the things, I know that everybody's taking an online class because you just, it's not going to be possible to fit a, an ordinary uh, real world class in that you have to go to classes to. And so I think that these are successful when all of us remain pretty flexible with the format. Thank you, Grace, for coming in. What I mean by that is, as soon as we're done with this class, I'll take the recording, I'll post it. When you go to attendance, you write down 5 things that you learned, either if you were here in person, things you learned in person, or if you watch the recording later. And it gives a certain amount of flexibility. You still have that context every week to keep you hopefully help with the understanding of the material, but also you have the flexibility if you have to work and you can't make it when the class is scheduled, you don't lose any points for watching it later, on another day or whatever. And I think that that is perfectly appropriate. My goal is to make sure to do, or my commitment rather, is to do everything I can to help you succeed. That means from my end, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure I grade everything as quick as possible. For hopefully that means within a week. Hi, Ryan. A lot of the times, or this should also look like from my end that I am going to be responding to emails within 24 hours. I also include in the course materials, there's my cell number. If you guys need to get a hold of me, you can do that through my cell number as long as you text and let me know your name and which course you're taking. That helps from my perspective. This is an art class. That means, and this is something that I need to cover because this is an art class. What that means is there are going to be depictions of the human form and potentially offensive material, political views, social commentary, different things like that, that are really hot topics that we don't talk about at family get-togethers for a very specific reason. How many of you have experienced a family get-together, like a Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner, that people started talking about politics and it ended really happily? Anybody? There's no hands going up, is there? And there probably never will be. I think one of the markers of the 21st century with this explosion of social media that is ubiquitous with breathing. Everybody's involved with social media all the time. I mean, even people taking photos of the peas and chicken that they eat every day. I mean, it's absurd. But one of the symptoms of that is that people are constantly looking for things to talk about. And what that sadly translates into is that almost everybody has had interactions with folks on social media who don't seem to be able to get away from the idea that they've got to be offended at everything, or they've always got to be offended at something, or somehow they've got to tell the world that they're a victim of something. All of you guys have experienced that in your social media feeds, haven't you? There's always that one person, maybe more, who has to be offended at everything. A lot of the times, offensiveness or being offended comes into play when somebody threatens our worldview or our social space. When we are initially trying to communicate with somebody, that happens a lot. The reason we don't walk away in a huff is because we actually want to find out what that person has to say, what that person has to offer. So I want everybody to set aside any potential knee jerk reactions to be offended at everything and just allow enough opportunity for the context of whatever it is we're looking at to sink in. This person may be offensive to you, or this material may be offensive to you, not because anybody is setting out to be a bully, because most often that is not the case, but just because it becomes a challenge to your personal social space. And that's it, just because it's different. So, can everybody make that commitment to agree to do everything possible not to be offended by the material that we come into contact with? Is that a fair thing to ask, especially in an art history course? We're going to be looking at stuff from all around the world. Now, the department has come up with a really good statement. The human form is a pretty standard subject of artistic expression. And there may be examples, particularly when we look at the Renaissance or and some of the painters that we look at, some of the sculpture we look at, like Michelangelo's David, a lot of it is going to be depictions of the nude human form. Now, I'm not going to even say that a majority of it is. A majority is not. There's going to be a little bit. But I need you not to be offended. It is not intended to be titillating. It is not intended to be a commodification of the human form, both of those things which are symptomatic of pornography. So we are not going to be looking at pornography in this class. But if you are under 18 or that kind of material could even potentially offend you, please let me know. I'll do what I can. But just know that in art classes, the things that we come to are important for the expression of the human perspective. And I just want you to go out of your way not to be hurt, because none of this is intended to be offensive. Does everybody buy into that? Does everybody agree with that, or feel okay with that at the very least? Okay. Because I am making the assumption all of you are mature enough to dress yourselves. So this stuff should not be a bother to you. But that is something that I need to say something about. Today, what I wanted to talk about is, and I think I mentioned it already. I know it's really, really boring when you go into class and they just rifle through the material of the syllabus. We're not going to do that. I am going to open up, do a screen share so you can see the stuff that's on there. But I'm expecting all of you guys to read that material on your own. There's just some things that I really think I need to talk about. And I'm glad America's here. I've worked with them before, and if I don't speak the correct language, my brain is like a pachinko machine. I have been diagnosed with being on the spectrum or neurodivergent now. So if I do something that is confusing, it's because you did not overhear the 90% of our conversation that's going on inside my head. And I depend on people like America to point that out, to bring me to a stop and say, would you please explain this material, because I think you forgot to say it out loud. So that's hopefully what we're going to be doing on for the next few minutes, and then we will talk about the Renaissance. So let me share my screen right here. I have put up, I believe, a calendar as well with the different kinds of things that we're going to be looking at. And this art history is exciting to me. We are not going to be doing the stereotypical stuff that you expect to see in art history. That is not what I do. I'll tell you a little bit more about myself, and then we'll go back and we'll talk about this a bit, what this image represents for me. I'm a stained glass designer. I've been a professional stained glass designer and builder for about a little over 30 years. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see you a little bit better. I have been a professional artist for that long. In the 90s, I was a software engineer. I was doing programming, things like that. I don't know if any of you are old enough to know what WordPerfect is. They were like the precursor to a lot of today's word processing programs. Like you probably use Word or Google Docs. They were the precursor to all that kind of stuff. I designed the fonts for that company. So I was the one who designed how a lot of these letters look that you see on some of those older word processing programs. And then at the end of the 90s, I came to somebody called Theophilus. He was a 14th or 15th century monk, traveled Europe, and wrote down the art processes that he saw in the guilds. The book that he wrote was called On Diverse Arts. And it dawned on me that our ancestors were really, really smart and did a lot of stuff. That was fascinating to me. And I became very heavily involved with traditional arts. That is, I did things like made paper. I'm a bookbinder. I design and bind books. I incorporate that in my glass sculptures. So I sew glass together into three-dimensional structures. With that, I also started learning about other religions, beginning with Islam. And I'm now a pluralist minister. I'm a chaplain. I'm a pluralist chaplain. That means I help people who are everything from animist and pagan all the way to, I work with a lot of Muslim groups. There's a Muslim group that meets on campus here. I write for um, there's a Ismaili congregation in Canada. Uh, the Ismailis there's about 50 million of them around the world. They follow somebody called the Aga Khan, and I write for some of the Muslim magazines that the Ismailis use. I became an expert on Rumi, who's a Muslim poet, and the Quran. But then I also work very much with traditional medicine. I'm an expert on hoodoo as well. I make tinctures and different things like that. I'm a certified alchemist. So a lot of different interests that come together in who I am, because I'm absolutely fascinated with the human desire and drive to communicate how we look at the universe around us, how we interact with it. Now, I've included something in the course where everybody to participate in, where you'll see it showing up on your things to do list, where you need to go in, have a picture, hopefully the pictures of you, but say a couple things about yourself, and then respond to what three other students in the class have said. So everybody needs to do that, and it's just kind of pretending that we care about each other as fellow human beings. But it's something to do online to hopefully create a little bit of a sense of community, even though we're all isolated through the internet. And the artwork that we're going to be looking at, I'm not having you memorize dates and times and names and places. We are going to be going at different times in the world. We're going to be looking at different places in the world. We're going to be looking at different people around the world and what they produced as art. Not because I want you to memorize a bunch of stuff, but art is kind of the vehicle that we use for communicating and understanding other people. That's why it's so important to make the commitment to choose not to be offended when you look at stuff. Because you look at material, it's not going to be what you're familiar with. And almost all the time, like 99% of the time, if you're offended at something, it's because you're seeing it out of the correct context. So that's something to be mindful of, I hope. I want to talk a little bit about, I think before we talk about the Renaissance and moving into that, I want to talk about the assignments that we have, and then I'm going to go back to that painting that I showed you earlier. I just need to do a screen share again. Forgive me for being so clunky with my computer interface. I don't have a 12-year-old to show me the ropes. All right, and we look at this, you'll see where to start. I want you to read this information and stuff, and I think that this is pretty good. This image that I have, we'll go back to exactly what this means in just a minute, but it is an important image. It actually is an image reflecting, communicating an event that happened which ended a world war in 2 hours of conversation. And we'll go back to that in just a sec. The introduction attendance, that everybody did that already. But I want to talk about the tools of artistic critique, and I want to talk about the challenge moving forward, and I want to talk about the weekly reflection as well as what attendance looks like. So we're going to do all those things, and then we're going to talk about the Renaissance and what that painting means. What do you guys think of when when you hear the word critique or critical? Is it positive or negative? Show me thumbs up or thumbs down. Positive? Thumbs down? So a lot of you do think it's positive. That's interesting because most of the time I find myself agreeing with Grace when I hear anything that sounds like critique, critical, my mind always reflexively goes to a negative space. Because when somebody says that they're giving you a critique, that's usually code for I'm going to rip you a new one. I'm going to tear your soul apart. I'm going to hurt your feelings. Um, and that's sad because what critique or critical actually means is with intention. When people become hypercritical, they will look for faults in absolutely everything they possibly can. And that is definitely a very negative thing. When we use the word critique in this class, what we are looking for, or what we mean, is you are going to be observing something with intention, and you're going to be using precise language to communicate what you see or what you experience. And that's really important. Now I'm going to share what this looks like in a practical way. And this you will need to do when you go into the weekly reflections. Be mindful of this. The 4 tools of artistic critique were introduced to me by a guy named Jason Lanigan, who is one of the professors at UVU and a friend of mine. What the tools of artistic critique address is how we approach something the first time we're encountering it. There are 4 steps, and then I'm going to talk about each of the steps briefly. The first step is describing. Second step is analyzing. Third step is interpreting, and fourth step is evaluation. Description is when we look at something and we're just using our big person words, our grown-up language, to precisely share what we encounter when we come to something new. This deals with things like um, how big something is, what's the color, what style is it done, what's the material look like. We may even be talking a little bit about the setting if the setting directly impacts how we view it. Like, for example, if we see a little carved sculpture, if we find it on the floor, perhaps that's going to provide some different information than if we find it in a box and we're describing opening the box to get at it. But description deals specifically with height, weight, pant size, color, material, style, all those kinds of physical attributes that describe the thing in a shared environment. All right. Does that kind of make sense? We're not putting a lot of emotion into it. We're just telling it like it is. The second one is analysis. This one, we start using our imagination a little bit. How did whoever made that thing make it? Are there techniques that we recognize? Does it look like the person molded it out of clay with their fingers, or did they mold it out of clay with tools? Or did they use both? Does it look like it was manufactured in a factory or in somebody's living room? Does it look like it was sewn or stapled? So these are the questions where we start asking about or imagining what processes are used to create what we're looking at. The third step is interpreting. This is when we start thinking about what kind of environment did that artist come from who made this? What could this possibly have been used for? Did they view the world from a lens of strong spiritualism or religion? Or did they view the world from a lens of practical social structures? Is there any way, does this art have any relationship or bearing on how they viewed the world like that? Generally, art will have a lot of bearing on how a culture views the world. And sometimes when we get to the interpretation step, that's when it's good to consider how old the artwork is and where it was made. Then that might tell us a little bit more about what it means to whoever used it. An example of this is if you find a set of baby shoes in an old house, that just may mean that at some time the family had a baby in the house and the shoes are lost. But if you find the baby shoes behind bricks in the foundation of the house, and we're talking about a house where the foundations were laid between 1870 and 1910, what does that mean? Anybody want to guess? In American construction, if we find baby shoes anywhere this side of the Mississippi, inside of a foundation that was laid between about 1870 and 1910, what that means is whoever built the home was hoping for a really bright and abundant future. They would find baby shoes. Sometimes it would just be one, most often it would be two, but they would put them in the foundation as a blessing to whoever lived in the home. Did you guys know that? But doesn't that little bit of information give a completely different context and meaning to that, what we found? Isn't that interesting? And that's just an example. And then the fourth step is evaluation. This is where we decide if what value the artwork might have, or if the artwork is successful. How successful is it? Does it speak to us? So these are questions. I want you to go over that page, that information, and think about that. On that, there's a lot of. I'm sorry, I stopped the screen share. I shut it off before I should have. Pardon me. On this, you see that there's elements of art and there's principles of design. I want you to try to use that vocabulary. Sorry, I had to step away for just a second. Try to use that vocabulary as you talk about these things, as you do your artistic critique. Use words, use language that's precise. Heidegger, who was the kindest and gentlest of all the Nazi philosophers, said that the moment we decide to use a word is also the moment where we no longer are using all the other possible words. So when we decide to be precise in our language, that really helps to communicate with some measure of exactitude what we are actually trying to say. And I'll give an example of this. If somebody, say one of your roommates, wanted to surprise you by making a cake, and they made a cake that was vanilla and lavender flavored, and your response was, "That's nice." Yes, it's a positive response, but do you think your roommate would be happier if you said something like, "I don't know exactly what I was expecting, but I love the fact that there's this hint of floral in there," which is not something that we typically get. I mean, vanilla is the most floral flavor we use in the West, and to have lavender in there too. I mean, this is just a surprise. I love it. How much happier do you think your roommate would be than if you just stopped at, "Oh, that's nice." Do you see what I'm saying? When we're precise with our language, not only does it allow us to think more clearly, but it helps us to communicate what we see better as well. Now that I'm going to jump around just a little bit. I'm going to go to the weekly reflection because I think that that ties in really well with what we were just talking about. The weekly reflection should show up in each of the modules, and you should only have they should only be due for each week that we do that the module that it's related to. When you do your weekly reflection, this is what I do. I do the projects and the reflections in lieu of quizzes and tests. So I'm sorry. I know that you're probably emailing me all excited for the flurry of tests that you knew that were going to be with a really exciting level of memorization in an art history class. And I'm really sorry to disappoint you on that regard. But we're going to be doing weekly reflections instead of quizzes, and we're going to be doing projects instead of tests. Now, the weekly reflections, what you're going to be doing is looking at the items for that week. Each week we cover several, anywhere from 3 to 50, but you only need to pick 1, 2, or 3 items. And what I want you to do, you have 250 to 350 words, or you could do more if you want. If you want extra credit, you can do more. Word count is extremely important in this. It cannot be lower than that range. It has to be at least that range. But what you're going to be doing is if you pick one object, you're going to do an in-depth analysis using each of the 4 tools of artistic critique in the order that they're given. Describe, analyze, interpret, and evaluate. Or you're going to pick 2 objects that we looked at, say a painting and a sculpture, or 2 sculptures made by very different people, or 2 sculptures made by the same person at different points in their career. You're going to pick 2 objects and do a shorter analysis for each of them, and then compare them in your writing. Or you're going to pick 3 objects and articulate elements of each which demonstrate the use of symbols or ideas that we were discussing within that module. So you can pick whichever one you want to do, and it doesn't really matter. For the first 2 weekly reflections, the most important thing is that you pick items or an item from the class in that module for that week, and that you articulate what you see using the tools of artistic critique. The reason I have to be clear about that is that I have had people do a series of these with items that they just picked out of around their living room, which was kind of frustrating because each week we're concentrating on a different aspect of art history from that time period. When you do your weekly reflections, it needs to be on art that you saw within the context of that module each week. Does that make sense? Okay. I'm going to stop sharing that. And I want to talk about the projects and the challenge moving forward. So I'm going to share that screen really quick. In this class, rather than tests, everybody's going to do a total of 7 projects. You're going to do 6 projects that are smaller ones and then a big final one. And I say big is relative. Instead of doing tests, you are going to be designing your own kind of mini projects, and they can be discovery or research. You have 6 projects, 2 of them need to be research, 2 of them need to be discovery, but the rest can be whatever you want. If you want to do 2 research ones and the rest are discovery, that's fine. Or you can do 2 discovery and the rest are research, that's fine. The difference is the research projects will be when you pick something to study. And that may be a particular artist you like, that may be a particular style of art that you like, or that might be a particular set of images that you like, or a style. But it needs to be, all your projects need to be within the scope of this class. Can anybody tell me what the scope of this class is? What is the time period of art that we are looking at for this class? Anybody? Olivia?
Is it Renaissance to contemporary?
Yes, absolutely. From 1350 to today. So that means if you want to do one of your discovery projects on the particular style of anthropomorphized vessels that were made in the Mississippian area between the 12th and 14th centuries, is that going to do it? It might if you only refer to the stuff that was done after 1350, but more than likely not, because the Mississippians had pretty much stopped producing artifacts by that time. Now, if you were going to be doing it on how Egyptians did their eyeliner and why and how they made it and make your own, is that going to cut the mustard for this class? No, for the exact same reason. It's out of the scope of this class. And you can do your research or discovery projects on anything that is art produced between 1350 and the contemporary day, and use the module headers as guidelines. So, if that's Japanese art from the Moji period, that's fine. Or if it's more contemporary kabuki, that's fine. I think one really interesting research project might be interviews with 7 of the men who now perform kabuki as women on the contemporary Japanese stage. That would be a really interesting research project. And then a research project is going to be things like PowerPoint about stuff that you researched, annotated bibliography, maybe a video that you've made where you present some of the research that you've done, stuff like that. Discovery, the difference is that discovery is going to be when you are recreating a Renaissance era cake, or you are showing what tattoos might have looked like from a 19th century American sailor. Stuff like that, where you're actually doing something. And I want you to go through this module, or this portion of the module is challenge moving forward. It's right at the beginning, and it talks about some of these different kinds of things. What I want you to do for this assignment, at this point, you are not doing a project. What you are doing is giving a proposal for a potential project that somebody else could do. That's what this assignment is about. Do you understand the difference? You're just writing an initial statement, a paragraph describing what it is, and then a suggestion of how long it might take. And that's what you're submitting for this particular thing. Now, on this example, I was pretending I was in my 2710 class. So that's examples from that. You could update it for something that is more contemporary, because it needs to be for this class between the times of 1350 and contemporary time, which is today. And in this, I'm giving a sentence that is the proposal, a paragraph, 3 to 5 sentences, where I talk about what the project would entail. And then at the end, it should only take 3 to 5 hours to do. and that's what you're submitting. For this, if you want extra credit, you can submit that and then 2 other additional um, proposals as well. But again, it is just a proposal. It is not the actual project. Does that make sense to everybody? And the reason why I'm having you do this is as we go into the projects, you're going to have a page that just shows all these different ideas that people have come up with through this process. And you can pick from there, or you can come up with your own idea from there. I think one of the most difficult things about this class is that a lot of it is self-directed. Or another option is you can just contact me and say, I'm really fascinated with the Romantic era paintings of women and uh, pianos, and I'd like to look into that anymore. Can you help me come up with a project idea around that? And I can tell you, I can help you come up with that. Right now, when you go to the first project module, you will see that there is a page, and that page has stuff that other people have suggested from last semester. And as soon as you guys submit your ideas for this semester, I will replace that page with your contemporary ideas. All right? Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. I do have a due date for the first project of next weekend, and I'm thinking we'll probably change that. We'll extend it a week just so that everybody has a pretty good idea of what to do um, after submitting your own ideas. Okay, I'm finding the very next thing to go to. I do want to talk a little bit about attendance. So I talked about those. Those are the 2 big assignments that go through this semester. About every 2.5 weeks, there'll be another project that's due. Each of those projects should be about 3 to 5 hours, which means with 6 of those, you'll have about 24 hours tied up in those projects, or that will represent about 24 hours of work. And you're thinking, holy crap, 24 hours, he's such a jerk. But that's 3 to 5 hours every 2.5 weeks, which works out to be an hour and a half a week that you're spending potentially on one of these projects. Is that doable? I think it's completely doable. And then the last one, you can, what I will have you do is write a proposal. And we'll talk about this at the beginning of November or end of October. You have you write a proposal for something you really want to do for your final project. That's going to represent 10 hours. And by that time, you'll have realized that a lot of these projects, you'll get into it, disappear down a rabbit hole, and you'll realize how easy it is to put that kind of time into one. But if you start a month and a half early before the end of the term, again, that's only an extra hour or 2 a week, and you can get it done easily. So it's not that. America, did you have a hard time with the projects? Okay. Thank you. I just, as soon as the question was out of my mouth, I was thinking to myself, oh no, did America just have a horrible time? I'm glad you didn't have a horrible time. Thank you. That was the right answer. I know I'm putting you on the spot, America, but would you mind sharing what kind of projects you did? Do you remember what they were?
So one of the ones that I did was based on one of the earlier modules that we did, and it was cave art. So what I did was that I crumpled up like a piece of lunch bag paper. I crumpled it up and I used charcoal to like try to mimic the cave art so that the paper all crumpled up, it would resemble the rock. It was something that I did it back in high school and I thought that I could redo it for this one. And yeah, that was one of the ones that I did.
Thank you. And that's a pretty cool project because what America did very specifically was find a material that mimicked the texture of a cave wall. And of course, this was in the 2710 class. And then using materials to paint on that mimicked what people would have had available to them at that time. And if I remember right, it took about 4.5 hours, didn't it? Something like that. Yeah. And that's the kind of, so the discovery, that was a particularly discovery project because America actually did something instead of researching something, but that also demonstrates critical thinking, research, and the application of artistic critique principles as well. So, and I think that was, for me, it's a lot nicer to see people do stuff like that than just to do tests, because we actually get to see how America's brain works instead of just seeing whether or not they can regurgitate facts. And that's one of the reasons I like having people do the projects instead. Thank you, America. Now, attendance, I think when we look at attendance, everybody, I hope that this is pretty straightforward. At the end of today, I will put the recording up right here. This is where you link to our class page on YouTube. And each week we'll have the recording of it. So if you work and you miss, or you're just not able to make it, no big deal. You can still get full points for watching the recording as well. But I do appreciate the fact when you guys show up in person. I appreciate that because it gives me somebody to talk to. But it also, what I found over the years is the people that show up every time to the live teams are almost always the people that get A's as well. A lot of other people get A's too, but it seems like that is more of a shoe-in. Anyway, but of course I've also had people get A's who never were able to show up to a meeting at all because they worked, and that's fine too. Either way, you'll get points. So all you have to do is write down 5 things that you learned during the course of the time that we had, either during the recording or live, and you get points for submitting that. And then on this also we have the introduction one. I introduced myself. Everybody's going to do. It looks like several people have already done this. Just write down a few things about yourself. Include a picture, hopefully a picture of yourself, and then respond to 3 other people in the class. And then we also talked about research and discovery projects. And it gives you more outline of what these actually entail. And then this discussion, you get points just for posting your project. Now, I want to stress something really quickly. I know that you're probably feeling a little bit of stress creep in. When you submit an assignment, because of the way that this is an online class, we don't get a lot of face-to-face interaction. If the assignment is not perfect, you don't get perfect points, I will tell you what's missing and how you can fix it. And then you go and take that information, turn around, fix it, and resubmit. And then you get perfect points. Okay, so I have had students resubmit the same thing 6 different times in order to get all the points. I don't mind. My primary responsibility is to make sure you guys succeed, to do everything I can to help you succeed. And so if that means you guys are resubmitting several times and I keep regrading it and adding points every time you resubmit it, I don't mind doing that. I have had one student go from a low C all the way up to an A- doing exactly that thing, resubmitting several of the assignments. That makes me happy because that means you're actively learning. So if you guys don't mind doing it, and then right here in the discussion, this is not a two-way discussion. All you're doing is posting your project on that, and you get points for posting it. And that way other people can see what you're doing. Now let's go back up here, and this is a really good opening to the Renaissance. This is a meeting between, I think he was the nephew of Saladin, Camille al-Malik, Malik al-Camille. Let's see. I know I have something in there somewhere about it. But this is the Sultan of Egypt, and this is a guy whose name was Frank. You probably know him better as St. Francis of Assisi. When St. Francis found out that a cardinal was trying to push towards a fifth crusade, he got angry because he felt that Christianity, that religion in general, was something to help people learn how to live together in peace. And so he went with his best friend, walked to the seashore, finally got somebody to take him across the Mediterranean to Egypt so that he could talk to Sultan Malik al-Kamil and Kamil. I'm sorry, I know I'm probably screwing up his name, because St. Francis knew that this gentleman was an intelligent person. He was Muslim. That meant that he was a rational thinker. And if he could just tell him and talk to him, tell him about Christianity and talk to him, that Malik al-Kamil would be smart enough to see that there was no reason for them to fight. He was allowed to go through the front lines because the cardinal that was pushing for the Fifth Crusade thought, okay, great, this guy's guys will kill our Christian, we'll have a martyr, and we'll be able to justify going in and fighting him. Instead, this gentleman here was so impressed with the bravery of St. Francis of Assisi that he immediately opened his doors, made him a favorite guest in his household, and they started really enjoying each other's company. The Fifth Crusade brought together people from all over the Christian world to fight against every Muslim they could find. So it was a world war. But in the 2-hour conversation that St. Francis and Sultan Kamil had, they laid the groundwork to stop the war. They ended a world war in a 2-hour conversation. I want you to put that into perspective just a little bit. Can you imagine if somehow world leaders involved in conflict were able to do that today, sit down in a 2-hour conversation, end the war? What ended up happening is that the Christian forces were camped around the Nile. The Nile flooded, so all the Christian forces, their horses were up to their chests in mud, and people were getting really sick with diarrhea. Sultan al-Kamil saw this. He got his doctors and physicians, essentially his emergency medical professionals, and a bunch of people produced a whole bunch of bread really quickly. And he rushed out onto the Nile plains with food and medicine, helped get the Christian soldiers' horses out of the mud, get them fed, gave them medicine so that they weren't so sick anymore. And then he told them, if you guys leave now, I will make sure you get to the Mediterranean. Just go away and leave us alone. And the cardinal that was pushing for the Fifth Crusade ended up living out the rest of his lives in an unnamed monastery somewhere in the Carpathian Mountains. Nobody saw him after this at all. What is so fantastic about this is that the meeting of minds, the meeting of worlds, the meeting of cultures, and people interacting with each other intelligently ended a military conflict. Now, why am I telling you about this? First, because I think these two guys are awesome, but also this lays the foundation for an understanding of where the Renaissance comes from. The Renaissance did not happen out of thin air. We had about 300 years of constant warfare with people interacting, Christians in Europe and Muslims in the Middle East interacting with each other on a constant basis. Do you think that there's any way they could resist learning from each other, even accidentally? There was a lot of cross-pollination there. And in previous, I don't have the music teed up, I think. Let's see if I can. No, I don't have the music teed up. But I'd like to have people listen to something where they listen to European music from before the Crusades. So we're talking about 950, 1050, right around there. And then we listen to the Muezzin call to prayer, and that is ubiquitous through a lot of these lands that the Crusaders were coming to, in Jerusalem and Egypt and the Middle East, Turkey, these kinds of areas. And then we listen to music that's produced in the early Renaissance. And the difference in Europe of the music produced between the early Renaissance and that pre-Crusader era is the tonal values of music that they encountered on the road when they heard the call to prayer. And that's what you hear in the Renaissance music, the Eastern call to prayer, which I think is absolutely fascinating. But the Renaissance, people are coming back after seeing the world's tallest building, the world's tallest structures, the world's biggest structures, after seeing areas like in Istanbul, where you could walk down the street and hear at any moment at least 5 different languages. We know a lot of the history of the Ottomans because of the Vikings that were uh, personal bodyguards to a lot of the Muslims that were living there. The from the Crusades, even though there was a lot of warfare there, what the Crusades brought us was severe, I'm not going to say severe, an extreme cross pollination of cultures, where people, for the first time in centuries, were discovering that the world was a huge place with a lot of other people that didn't look like them or sound like them, but were humans just the same. And they learned from each other. And then people started coming back home and trying to recreate what they had learned while they were on the Crusades. And that's where we get Gothic architecture building into what became the Renaissance. Does anybody know what Renaissance means? What that word means? Naissance is a word that means birth. So Renaissance is essentially a rebirth, a refiguring of the world. We get people that for centuries were hip deep in their own manure throughout Europe, and then they come back from the Crusades and they realize that these things the Romans built were roads. So they start rebuilding roads throughout Europe. They realize that you can figure amazing things using math. So they used math. Literacy started taking off. Even though in the early Renaissance, people were more illiterate than they were 600 years earlier in Europe, or more people could read and write in the 8th century in Europe than they could in the 13th century. But people start becoming more and more fascinated with the magic that's held in books. Do you guys know what the Hagia Sophia is? Have you ever heard that? One of the waypoints on the Crusades was going through what used to be called Constantinople and is now Istanbul. In that was a building that was built by Constantine in the 3rd through the 5th century, because it was burnt and then rebuilt. That building was the largest structure, the largest lived-in building that the world had seen up until that time. It was a Christian church, and it was called the Wisdom of God, or the Hagia Sophia, or Holy Wisdom. It is so tall that clouds are witnessed to have formed on the inside of the building. Can you imagine this? So this is almost a 2,000-year-old building. People are coming back to Europe after seeing that building for the first time. So tall, it had clouds inside of it. Can you imagine how that might affect how people started building and constructing things? Or seeing what the Mughals were doing in India and how the fantastic architecture in India and bringing that back with them. Or the amazing things that they saw in Northern Africa, bringing that back with them. Just the fact that they saw things so big and so amazing, knowing that they could do it themselves, and then developing the math, bringing home the math in order to figure all that kind of stuff out. And that's the kind of environment that created the Renaissance. We're going to be talking in this module. It's basically an introduction to the Renaissance, and I want you to watch these videos. I like to have several different videos that deal with the same kind of stuff. But think about what I've said, and think about the Renaissance as a rebirth that comes from a cross-pollination of cultures. Have any of you guys ever been to Taco Bell? Do you like it? I really like it. I like it a lot. The birth of that whole genre of food, what we consider to be Mexican cuisine here in the US, is a renaissance of food culture that began in about 1950s. And that renaissance of food culture is people wanting to get rid of lower grade chicken, pork, and beef in an American culinary setting. And then somebody else coming up from Central America saying, okay, don't throw this away. We can do marvelous things with it. Let's combine it with some of the stuff that you've seen that we can do too. And so it's peasant culinary, it's essentially peasant food from everybody's family, that everybody produced stuff in essentially uh, middle income Mexico, combining with uh, food expectations in the United States. And that cross pollination of systems gave us what is now Tex-Mex. You know, and it's a really, I mean, if you come to anybody and say, I could really use a taco, you know exactly what they're saying, don't you? I mean, I want something that's tasty. I want something that tastes really good right now. And that's where the magic of taco-ness comes, from that cross-pollination of culinary cultures. And I want you to kind of think of the Renaissance being the beautiful construction of kind of a mental taco, the cross-pollination of the Middle East, North Africa, and European cultures. There's a lot more to it than that, but I think that's a pretty good reference. I hope I didn't offend anybody. Are there any vegans that are offended when I'm talking about different meats? I hope not. Now, I want to share this with you, and I'm hoping that this will work out. A lot of the time, sometimes when I share a video on YouTube, even though it's open source like the Smart History ones, um, we it will ding it. So I'm hoping this isn't dinged. Some of the things we'll talk about when we talk about art history are things like context. We already spoke about context. And another thing we'll talk about is symbolism. Symbolism is really important. This is a really good video, and we do have the time to watch it. I want to watch the whole thing with you, and I'll pause it and we'll talk about it. All right? Is that okay? Is that okay with everybody? Okay.
We're in the Metropolitan Museum of Art looking at this tiny little painting, but there's such a level of detail here. You could be lost in this painting for hours.
We're looking at a painting of the Madonna and Child by the artist Carlo Crivelli from around the year 1480. And the painting has beautiful detail, such a richness to the landscape that we're seeing and to the fabrics that we see throughout this painting.
We're seeing a really common theme. We're seeing the Virgin Mary holding.
Okay, I want to pause for a little bit and see if I can expand this. Oh man. Okay, I was trying to.
The young Christ child.
Let's see if we can expand it. Okay, I'm sorry I can't make it bigger right now for whatever reason. But this painting is important for a couple reasons. And I'm going to move forward just a little bit. Okay, here we go. This thing is about a foot tall and about maybe 9 inches wide, something like that. It's pretty small. But when we look at this comes from about the Middle Renaissance. Renaissance started right around 1350 is the year that we're using. There are some elements to this that are very typical of European Renaissance type rendering. And I'm going to talk through a little bit of the symbolism just for you to keep your ears and eyes open for, and then we'll watch the rest of the video. First off, this is a Madonna and Child. That references Mary, the mother of Christ, and the Christ child. I'm sorry, I can't get rid of the words right there right now. This is a very standard theme. A lot of saints are used, a lot of biblical stories, a lot of things like that. And one thing to be mindful of is that this represents a lot of things that were very important to people in the Renaissance. And they'll talk about that in the movie. One thing to be mindful of as well is that notice that the figure is distorted a bit. That's done on purpose. This is not done because people were stupid. When you see a painting like this, the painting you're seeing is not done because somebody didn't know what they're doing. It is done because somebody knew precisely what they're doing. Why do you think some of the reasons might be that they are showing a distorted human form, knowing that they could do a realistic form? Okay, Jenny, can you come up with an idea or propose an idea?
Um,
Why would it,
I don't know why they would make it so distorted. I mean, like you look at her fingers and her fingers are like really long and skinny and like Jesus and like the baby's legs are like I wouldn't say deformed, but they're very like it's not like human realistic almost, but in a way it is. So I don't know why they would purposely do that.
those are really good observations because you picked a couple things. Thank you, Jenny. And the only reason I picked on Jenny was because her name is at the top center of my screen. That's it. Uh, you will notice that in the Renaissance era, human figures, when they're distorted, are distorted for very specific reasons. And it's not, again, it's not because they didn't know what they were doing. And what Jenny picked out is very important. Notice that the baby Jesus does not look like a baby, and Mary's fingers look really unnatural. And I'll tell you the reason why those are two very important observations. One is Mary is depicted as somebody who lives in a celestial space. This is not intended to be a realistic looking person. The artist did this on purpose. So when you see a depiction of Mary like this and she looks odd, it's because she's supposed to be living in an eternal realm. She looks different because she's not living with us. She's a celestialized being. Okay, Mary, the Mother of Heaven, Mary, the Mother of God, is a queen in heaven, in the understanding of the world that Christians had at the time during the European Renaissance. So she's not supposed to look mortal because she is not mortal. You'll notice that her skin has a really disgusting pallor. That's not because that was the depiction of beauty at the time necessarily. That's because she's not supposed to be looking like normal human skin. Now, another idea, one of the reasons why Jesus is always shown as an angry little old man when he's a baby is not because they knew he was an angry little old man. That's not what they're trying to portray. What they're trying to show is this idea that the moment that Jesus was conceived, he was completely perfect. This is according to Christian theology in Europe at the time. So when even though they knew what babies look like, every artist had to practice drawing human babies as part of their routine. That's how they became gained credibility as an artist. What they're trying to show is that Jesus was a perfected being from the point of conception by the symbolism of him having semi-adult proportions as a baby. So does this make a little bit more sense now? We are dealing with a depiction, a symbolization of ideas, and not an artist doing a horrible job. Because if you look at the fruit at the top of the painting, it is photorealistic. It is perfectly rendered. Or the fly at the bottom left is perfectly rendered. So this artist knew what they were doing. So these choices that Jenny picked out, that the artist did for a very specific reason. And that helps guide our understanding of context for the time period. Does this make a little bit more sense now? Why it looks so odd? Okay. I'm going to try really hard to keep my mouth shut as we watch the rest of the video.
He sits on a pillow and is balanced on a ledge. And this is a scene that we see over and over again, especially in Venice. And it's worth noting that Crivelli is Venetian, although he spent most of his career south of Venice in the Marches.
Mary and Jesus are set before a parapet that is draped with this beautiful piece of yellow silk. And then behind the Virgin Mary, we see another piece of silk in a lavender color. And it's being held up by red laces that then are winding around branches from which are growing apples and a cucumber.
Almost everything in this painting is symbolic. We're treated to this lavish, beautiful, detailed scene, but it's a painting that actually offers much more to people.
Okay, I'm just going to ask, does anybody know what cucumbers and apples represent? What they symbolize? Because there's a very specific reason they were picked. Yes, Jenny.
Well, for the apple, I feel like has to relate to like the fall, like with Adam and Eve. As far as the cucumber, I'm not sure what that has to do, but the apple, I would assume, is probably because it has to do with the fall.
That's really a really solid assumption. And you're right. And one of the reasons why thank you. One of the reasons why the apple was picked to represent the fall is because when you slice an apple horizontally, does anybody know how many seeds you see? There's 5 seeds. This is important because when you look at Venus in the night sky and map Venus going around over a couple of years, you'll see a 5-petaled flower showing up, and 5 becomes a symbol for the divine feminine. And so apples were picked because they represented the divine feminine, and because the reason for the fall, according to Renaissance era Christian understanding, was because Eve got Adam to eat the fruit. So it all ties in to the idea of femininity, and then because it's behind Mary, it now becomes divine femininity, and it refers to Venus, the planet that represents the divine feminine, and somehow the apple is okay sitting behind Mary because it reminds us of the fall. But in this context, Mary is the queen of heaven, so the apple now is safe. She represents perfected womanhood. Isn't that interesting? All those kind of things tying together. Anybody want to have a guess? And I hope I don't offend anybody. Is anybody going to be brave enough to say what you're all thinking the cucumber represents? Because I guarantee you're right. The cucumber in this case is a phallus, and it represents the divine masculine. It's close to the apple because it represents the relationship that Adam and Eve had together during the fall, and it represents that the overcoming of the weakness of the fall is through the strength of the divine masculine as represented in the masculine Jesus. Isn't that interesting? Now, I'm not saying whether this stuff is right or wrong. I'm just saying this is some of the narrative that goes behind the symbols that are being used. Isn't that fascinating?
Who speak the language of art in the 15th century.
The apples are symbols of the fall, for instance, or the sin of humankind. If you think about Eve being tempted in the Garden of Eden by the serpent with the tree of knowledge with the apple.
Those red laces that hold up that beautiful pink lavender cloth of honor almost look serpent-like.
Notice how she carefully avoided any talk about the cucumber.
As they reach over, almost as if the ends of those laces are the heads of the serpent.
And then another common symbol we see is the goldfinch, this little bird that the baby Jesus is grasping to his chest. And the goldfinch is a symbol of redemption.
And that plays in direct opposition.
I'm going to say something else about the bird. A lot of the times you will see the baby Jesus with birds. Does anybody know why? Jenny, give it a shot. You were right about the apple. Why not?
I think it has to do with the Holy Ghost, because in the Bible it says that the Holy Ghost descended upon Jesus Christ in the form of a dove. So I would assume the bird representation is like the Holy Spirit.
I think that's a really solid assumption. That is excellent. Very good observation. And it's fascinating to me that the bird is used quite a bit. And regardless of the species, somehow that bird communicates symbolically the relationship to the turtle dove, which was symbolizing the Holy Spirit. Yes, absolutely. The turtle dove, I think, became a symbol for the Holy Spirit because the turtle dove was the cheapest sacrifice that a Jewish family could offer as a redemptive sacrifice. It was like the lowest common denominator for people that were trying to be saved. And by having the very lowest symbol representing the highest thing, I think is one of the really fascinating symbolic aspects of Christianity. But yeah, yes, absolutely. When you see a bird, it almost always ties back into that, if not always. Another thing that's really fascinating to me when the baby Jesus holds a bird is there were a series of gospels that you guys probably are not familiar with called the Gnostic Gospels, which were a number of things that were not included in the Bible when it was formed in the 3rd century. Some of these were the gospels that talked about Jesus's childhood growing up. They were called the infancy gospels. Look up something called the infancy gospels of Thomas when you get a chance to. In that, one of the things it talks about is Jesus had the power to resurrect when he was a baby, when he was a child. And after rainstorms, while his family were living in Egypt, one of the things that he would do is he'd take his father's compasses that his father used in the wood shop and go around and he'd describe perfect circles wherever he saw a puddle. And which really big sign of nascent OCD. But the other thing that he would do is he'd find the little starlings, the little goldfinches, the baby birds that had fallen, and he would resurrect them so they could start breathing again and fly off. Isn't that interesting? And so having Jesus hold a little bird to his chest also symbolizes that kind of folklore about his power to resurrect as a child. And then have you ever heard the term even God knows when even the birds die, or the fall of a sparrow? Have you guys ever heard those kinds of phrases? Yeah, that's another reference. And it's fascinating to me. People didn't have TV sets at the time, so they had to get their information from somewhere. And so a lot of these artists packed a lot of that kind of stuff into these kinds of things. Okay.
To the apple. If Adam and Eve caused the fall of man, in this Christian iconography, Jesus is the Redeemer.
One of my favorite details in this painting is the fly on the lower left, and it is actually another symbol of sin in this painting. The fly is actually painted in trompe-l'oeil, or this trick of the eye, where it's proportionate to us, the viewers, and not proportionate to the Virgin Mary and child.
It's actually terrifyingly large in relationship to the Christ child. In fact, it's as large as Jesus's feet.
It's supposed to look like the fly has just landed on the surface of the painting, but it's another common symbol of sin in the Renaissance. By this point, around 1480, you have the influence of northern, particularly Flemish painting on parts of Italy. And we really get a sense of that here in the background, in the landscape.
The landscape, which we only see at the extreme left and right, just peeking out at the edges of the cloth of honor, goes into this beautiful deep space. And we're given pathways for our eye to travel. And in that landscape, we actually see figures. These are clearly not modern Western European figures.
The figures that we see in the background are all wearing turbans. Now, at this point in the Renaissance, there is a trope of showing peoples of the Eastern Mediterranean wearing turbans because by 1480, the Holy Lands are controlled by Muslim powers. Using the turban was a convention for locating people in the Holy Lands. It became a symbol of others. And so you not only see Muslims wearing turbans, but you also sometimes see Jews wearing turbans as well.
Although this may not be historically accurate, it is still a way of locating the Virgin Mary in the Middle East. The artist uses another device to speak of antiquity, and we see that in the ledge that the Christ child sits on. We can just make out that there's some relief carving on our side of that ledge, and that's mimicking ancient Roman motifs. So we have a geographic locating to the Middle East, and we have a temporal locating to the ancient world, although those symbols are separate.
Another way that Crivelli locates this scene in the Middle East is the mantle worn by Mary. She's wearing this very elaborate damask textile well. And while it's not uncommon to see that, this type of textile, the motifs that we're seeing.
I'm pausing it again, sorry. What do you notice about the number of petals right here? How many petals are in this flower? Anybody?
5.
5. How many seeds in the apple?
Same.
Yeah, so is it appropriate that Mary has something like that with 5 petals on it?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And notice, what are the colors? The dark blue, like the darkness of like the evening sky, and then gold, like the gold of heaven. Really solidly locates her as a queen of heaven, doesn't it?
Also
On it
just really
speak to an
looks like-
aesthetic that you would find on Islamic textiles.
I'm sorry, did somebody say something?
Sorry, I should have raised my hand. It just looks like something royalty would wear too.
Oh, absolutely. And the reason it looks like something the royalty would wear is that this is precisely what royalty would wear. Persian carpets, Persian rugs, Egyptian carpets, they were so expensive to get into Europe that very quickly they became a symbol of nobility and royalty. So you're exactly right. And that dark blue, that kind of dye is very expensive, and gold thread, both of those are very strong symbols of royalty. So yeah, you hit the nail right on the head.
Even if by this point you have Italian textile makers replicating this type of pattern from the Eastern Mediterranean.
This is such a complicated issue because we understand the Virgin Mary as having been very poor, but is shown here in the most elaborate garb. And that has to do in part with not only a way of symbolically representing the Virgin Mary's spiritual importance, but also because the East was associated with elaborate and very expensive textiles.
We see that accentuated even by the halos, which are both done in gold, and they're decorated with pearls and precious gems.
And actually, those halos also remind me of Northern painting and the way that material wealth was used as a means of representing divinity.
One of the things that I'm always struck by when looking at this painting is the juxtaposition between the intense illusionism of things like the cucumber and the apples and even the textile that's hanging behind Mary and their faces or their bodies in general, where you have this flattening or this wax-like quality to the faces of both the Virgin Mary and Jesus.
The hypernaturalism that we see in the representation, for instance, of the cucumber, which is often used as a symbol of resurrection, has always seemed to me in the work of Crivelli as a means of representing the truth, the veracity of what we're seeing. But there is a real distinction between forms like the cucumber and the flesh of the primary figures, and I'm not sure that we fully understand what that contrast is meant to represent, but perhaps it has to do with the apples and the cucumbers being of this earth, and the Virgin Mary and the Christ child as being spiritual figures.
This painting was likely used for private devotion. It's on a small scale, could easily be held or used on a private altarpiece, say in a elite home. And this type of painting is really common in Crivelli's work overall.
Look at the hands that Crivelli has painted. Look at the delicacy with which the Virgin Mary holds the Christ child. Her fingers are holding him in place. But if you look at her right hand, there's a shadow between her hand and Jesus's hip. The turn from her thumb to her forefinger mimics his side and creates a volume. It creates this marvelous sense of space, but also of the preciousness of the child that she holds.
Crivelli has also signed this painting using a trompe-l'oeil piece of paper at the bottom of the painting, and it says Opus Caroli Crivelli Venetti, which is locating this is done by Carlo Crivelli from Venice.
We can imagine somebody in a private home using this painting as a means of veneration. So although the forms that we see here may be foreign to us, for the person who commissioned this in the 15th century, each of these elements would have had meaning and would have combined with this exemplary painting to produce a powerful spiritual image.
So what did you think about that from the beginning when we first saw it to now after talking about it and watching that video about it? Yes, Grace.
I honestly thought it looked like really weird with all the different types of elements and stuff. Like, it didn't really make sense to me. but I really had to like take a step back and like see what everything meant for me to understand it and appreciate it more.
Do you think you have a better understanding, appreciation of it now than you did when you first saw it?
Oh yeah, when I first saw it, I was like, wow, she looks really off, almost uncanny, and like all the weird little random elements were just like what was this person thinking when they made this? But now I feel like, oh wow, this had so much like depth and feeling towards it.
Yeah, I really appreciate your observations, because I think that the most effective way, thank you very much, Grace. I think the most effective way that we can approach these things that we encounter is by assuming that the artist is doing everything on purpose. So the assumption that the Renaissance was the first time anybody drew in perspective or anybody drew realism is completely false. And that assumption was actually generated through the age of enlightenment, the era of enlightenment, as people were trying to differentiate the Renaissance from all the time periods before. They were saying, well, now this is the first time people are starting to think. So that is not really, that's a perspective that doesn't hold a lot of weight with the real world, what was really going on, but it's still very prevalent among a lot of people's understanding of art history. And when we assume, though, that what we're seeing is because this is what the artist wanted to show us, then it lets us know that people are using these paintings as a way to communicate and tell stories, to communicate information, tell really important stories. That was the best format, the best way that they could do it at the time. You're dealing with an era with 12 to 18% literacy at the most among the wealthiest families. And how else are you going to get the information reinforced that you need to learn? Does that make more sense to people? Okay. Now we are close to winding up. I think I've covered everything I really want to. Maybe not everything I want to, but everything that I really intended to. Does anybody have any questions about the material that we've covered? Because I really need you to go through, as we move forward in this class, the way that this is going to be most effective is if you go through all the material on your own in the modules, and you either attend or watch the recordings of the class Teams meetings. Because those two things together, the Teams meetings are to help provide context for the material. I'm sorry, Ryan included stuff. Okay, before I tie up, I got to respond to what Ryan was saying. I'm sorry, Ryan. I did not notice that this was in there. Oh yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting how like Aztec cooking translates forward into contemporary culinary experience, and this is a really valid. Ryan says, I guess it was the style of the time, so they were exaggerating features when we talk about looking at that painting, and I think that is an absolutely valid assumption that we can make. But I think it's also really important to make the assumption that the artist is doing stuff because that's what they intend to do. And if they're doing something that doesn't look quite right or is a little bit out of proportion, I think a lot of the times it's a pretty safe bet to assume, like with Crivelli's painting we just saw, that those distortions were intended to be there and that they're specifically communicating something. So thank you, Ryan, for those observations. And yeah, the question is, but Mary was a virgin. At one point in European Christianity, even though Jesus had 5 younger siblings, and in some cases, some people believe 5, some historians say as many as 8. He had 3 younger brothers who were apostles as well. and he had at least 2 younger sisters. At one point, since Mary was a virgin when she conceived Jesus, and it was important that she remained a virgin until his birth, uh, that translated into a perspective on theology that held that Mary, at the moment that each child was born, became a virgin again, and she was virginal during the conception of the next child as well, which is kind of interesting to me. It's a little bit problematic because Joseph was considered to be the father of all of Jesus's younger siblings, which would have been a really fancy trick to pull off if she became a virgin again after every birth. So that's, I don't know, some of these things, when you start talking about theology, get really super confusing. But the appreciation and understanding from most Catholics at the time was that Mary was a virgin at the point of Jesus's conception and throughout her pregnancy, but that she was, everything was completely normal within the confines of a legal marriage after Jesus's birth for the rest of her life. And she was honored as holding the badge of the virgin conception throughout her life and afterwards. Does that kind of address, Ryan, what you were talking about? Does anybody else have any questions about the stuff that we've talked today? Okay, America.
So one of the weekly reflections says that it's also due the same day as the first one.
Okay,
It says
I
that
will
the
take care of
second one
that.
was due the same day.
Yeah, and that should not be the case. Thank you. I'm going to change that right now. You will notice that you have due dates and stuff to read everything for week 2. I'm just noticing when I update a module, I plug in the beginning and end dates, and it's supposed to update all that automatically. And evidently that is not the case. So I'm changing that right now. Okay, America, could you refresh and see if I just took care of it? Did that take care of it? Okay. All right. Each module should only be for 1 week. I'm not going to have you guys do 2 modules in a week unless it's one of the project things. So thank you, America, for pointing that out. Well, the next couple days, I'll try to take care of all those. All right. You should only have 1 weekly reflection due each week. That's it. All right. Any other questions? Great observations tonight, guys. Thank you very much. I'm so glad you were able to join me. At the end of this, tonight I will be posting a recording of this on our class channel and give you the link in the attendance assignment. Everybody that was here to get a credit for tonight, just go to that and submit 5 things you learned. Everybody that was not here that needs to watch this, go back to the attendance thing, watch it, and then submit the 5 things you learned during the course of the video. All right? If you guys have any questions, email me and I will respond, and then we'll talk about it next week as well. All right. I really look forward to having you guys in this class and seeing what you guys come up with. I hope you guys have a wonderful and safe weekend. Try not to get arrested unless it's worth it. And I will look forward to seeing you guys safe, healthy, bright, and squirrely next Thursday. All righty? We'll see you guys.